Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into the 2 centuries that literally tore down the medieval world and built the modern one. Between 1450 and 1648, Europe didn't just evolve, it was completely reinvented by 4 massive overlapping revolutions. So, here's our roadmap. First, we'll get a handle on the sheer scale of this transformation. Then, we'll break down the 4 key revolutions in how people thought, how they were governed, their reach across the globe, and how they did business, all of which forged a brand new European order. All right, let's set the stage. To really get what's going on with these revolutions, you have to appreciate just how profoundly different the world was in 1450 compared to 1648. It was like a complete operating system upgrade for an entire continent. I mean, this was a total paradigm shift. Europe went from this patchwork of local lords, all under the spiritual thumb of the church, to a continent of powerful, centralized states. The entire focus of life pivoted from just worrying about salvation in the next world to human achievement right here, right now. And local farm economies, they got swapped out for global trade. This contrast, this is the key to understanding everything that comes next. And it all kicked off with a fundamental update to Europe's software, its whole way of thinking. This intellectual explosion started in Italy and then just spread like wildfire, changing how people saw themselves and their place in the entire universe. At the very heart of this was humanism. Now, for centuries, the medieval mindset was basically that humanity was sinful, pretty insignificant, and that life on Earth was just a long, miserable test for the afterlife. Well, humanism just completely flipped that script. It looked back to ancient Greece and Rome and said, hold on, humans have immense potential for greatness, for creativity, and for incredible achievement right here, right now. But humanism wasn't some monolith. It kind of adapted as it spread north. Down in the rich, competitive city-states of Italy, it morphed into what we call civic humanism. It was all about secular power and public life. Think of Machiavelli's advice for rulers. But up in Northern Europe, thinkers like Erasmus created Christian humanism. They fused these new ideas with a passionate desire to reform the church and promote a more personal, ethical faith. And this intellectual fire wasn't just stuck in some ivory tower with a few scholars. Oh no. That's thanks to a revolutionary piece of tech, Gutenberg's printing press. Before printing, ideas literally moved at the speed of a walking monk. Afterwards, they moved at the speed of a press. Just think about it. 40,000 different book titles in print by 1500. Radical new ideas could now completely bypass the old gatekeepers, like the church, and go straight to thousands of readers. This new way of thinking wasn't just happening in books and art. It completely changed the idea of power itself, and that sparked a political revolution that forged the modern state as we know it. So how they pull it off? Well, the new monarchs in places like England, France, and Spain basically launched a systematic takedown of the old feudal system. They seized control of the church in their own countries. They created national tax systems that went right around the nobility. They built professional bureaucracies that were loyal only to them. And they raised royal armies. This took away the nobles' ability to even think about challenging them. Power was being sucked from the edges right into the center. And this new, incredibly pragmatic, and let's be honest, often ruthless approach to running a state was perfectly captured by Machiavelli. His book, The Prince, was basically the handbook for these new monarchs. It just tossed out the old medieval idea that a king should be some pious, moral father figure. No, Machiavelli argued that for a ruler, power, order, and the stability of the state, that's all that matters. Now, with these stronger, more ambitious states, they didn't just look inward. They started looking outward, beyond the shores of Europe. And this sparked a global revolution that was driven by 3 simple but incredibly powerful motives. And the motivations really were that simple and powerful. Gold was the hunt for new wealth, especially finding a way to bypass the Ottoman Empire's control of trade routes to Asia. God was the genuine, though often violently forced, desire to spread Christianity. And glory was that intense, cutthroat competition between these new states to claim territory and prestige on a global stage. The most immediate and absolutely catastrophic consequence of this encounter was the Great Dying. See, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought diseases with them, smallpox, measles, that the indigenous peoples had zero immunity to. The result was a demographic collapse unlike anything in human history. In places like the Incan Empire, up to 90% of the population vanished. It's a staggering loss of life that, tragically, made European conquest all the more easier. This contact kicked off something we now call the Columbian Exchange, a massive two-way transfer that permanently reshaped the entire planet. Things like potatoes and corn from the Americas actually fueled a population boom back in Europe. But going the other direction came sugar, horses, and tragically, millions of enslaved African people transported to the Americas to create new plantation economies built on just the most brutal exploitation. All right, this flood of new resources from the Americas, especially all that silver, triggered our fourth and final revolution, a complete transformation of Europe's economy that laid the groundwork for modern capitalism. So, to fund these incredibly expensive and frankly super risky overseas voyages, a brilliant financial tool was invented: the joint stock company. You can think of it as the 16th century version of a startup. It's the direct ancestor of the modern corporation. Instead of one king funding everything, hundreds of private investors could buy shares in a voyage. If it failed, hey, you only lost a little bit. But if it hit big, everybody got rich. This mobilized huge amounts of private money for global expansion. And all that silver pouring in from Spanish mines had a really destabilizing effect. It caused a century of crazy inflation that we call the price revolution. But even more importantly, it fundamentally shifted Europe's economic center of gravity. The old Mediterranean powers like Venice, they started to decline. And the new Atlantic states, Spain, Portugal, England, the Netherlands, they rose to dominate global trade. So, after all this, after these intellectual, political, global, and economic revolutions, how did it all finally come together? Well, it culminated in a new political order, one that was basically set in stone in the year 1648. This whole period was just torn apart by brutal wars, often fought over religion. They finally came to an end with the Peace of Westphalia. And this treaty was monumental because it established the single most important political idea to come out of this whole era: the sovereign state. For the first time, everyone basically agreed that the rulers, not the Pope, not the Holy Roman Emperor, had the ultimate authority over what happened inside their own borders. The modern international system was born right then and there. So by 1648, the medieval world was well and truly gone. In its place stood a continent of powerful, sovereign states, all fueled by global trade and armed with new ideas about human potential. But this new order, it didn't exactly bring peace. Instead, by creating these powerful monarchs and challenging religious authority, it set the stage perfectly for the next century of conflict. The big question was no longer about a universal church, it was about a new one. Who held the ultimate power, the king or God?